Shattered Mirror, Reflections on the Limits of Mind, Unknowingness in History. It is a curious feature of human nature that, time and again, we are drawn to the limits of our own understanding. We sense that we must know, that we must probe the boundaries of our knowledge, yet we repeatedly encounter profound reminders that our finite minds cannot take in the totality of existence. This is no recent realization. From the earliest records of human thought, sages and philosophers have warned of the deep mysteries that elude our grasp. What follows is a wide-ranging narrative, without the rigid frames of subheadings, charting a sweeping history of these warnings and reflections, weaving together a tapestry of voices that echo across millennia. If there is any unifying chord binding these voices, it is the recognition of how small our vantage point truly is before the expanse of all that can be known, or that might be known. In the days of ancient Greece, we encounter Socrates, that pivotal figure whom posterity deems the wisest of his time, precisely because of one foundational piece of self-awareness. He knew that he did not know. We find one of the earliest, clearest expressions of epistemic humility in Plato's dialogues, wherein Socrates repeatedly challenges the proud claims of others, whether orators or craftsmen or even other philosophers, by cutting through their certainties with carefully placed questions. Yet behind every question, behind every demonstration that the purported expert's knowledge might be shallow or incomplete, lay Socrates' own sense that total knowledge was elusive, perhaps unattainable. In Plato's Apology, he is reported to have said, "I am wiser than this man. Neither of us probably knows anything really worthwhile, but he thinks he does, whereas I do not." Although the exact wording can vary in translation, the spirit is consistent. Socrates' wisdom was that he was constantly aware of the boundary of his knowing. His approach to conversation was a disciplined pursuit of clarity, but also a reverence for the ultimate cloudiness of perfect knowledge. That is the seed of epistemic modesty, the admission that there is something that transcends us, or at the very least transcends the knowledge we think we hold. But Socrates was by no means alone in the ancient world in recognizing the limits of reason. Lao Tzu, often spelled Lao Tzu, operating in a very different cultural context, came to very similar insights about our inability to pin down the ultimate nature of reality. If Socrates' watchword was, "I know that I know nothing," Lao Tzu might be said to have offered an equally evocative caution in the Tao Te Ching, when he wrote, "The Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao." Such a short phrase, and yet it carries the cosmic weight of an entire worldview. For Lao Tzu, the fundamental ground of existence, the Tao, is indescribable in its fullness and transcends any statement, concept, or category one might apply to it. Words, definitions, logical distinctions, all of these point or hint at ultimate reality, but they never fully capture it. The moment one tries to confine the Tao into a conceptual box, the living essence slips away. With characteristic poetic subtlety, Lao Tzu reminds us that language, though a wondrous tool, remains forever inadequate when faced with the infinite interplay of all things. A labyrinth of words cannot trap the unfolding mystery. Where Socrates used cross-examination to demonstrate the illusions of certainty, Lao Tzu wielded paradox and aphorism to dissolve the illusions of conceptual rigidity. In both these ancient figures, we see a similar lesson, though approached through different cultural vantage points. Acknowledging one's ignorance, ironically, is often the closest approach to wisdom. But these were not isolated voices. Across the ancient world, similar insights emerged in various philosophical and spiritual traditions. The Upanishads in India speak in riddling ways about the Brahman that cannot be named, while Indian philosophers of the Charvaka or Buddhist traditions also grappled with the problem of illusions, conceptions, and the limitations of sense perception and reason. In many ways, each tradition emphasized that the world's fullness cannot be reduced to neat logical forms, any more than an ocean can be contained in a bottle. Centuries later, in the medieval Christian world, Nicholas of Cusa stands out as a theologian and philosopher who took these lessons of limitation to fresh heights, if one may speak of scaling such heights by underscoring our inability to do so. A cardinal of the Roman Catholic Church and a polymath, Nicholas of Cusa wrote a small masterpiece of philosophical theology titled De Docta Ignorantia, on learned ignorance. In it, he posited that God, or the Absolute, so far outstrips human cognitive capacity that we can only properly speak of our relationship to it in terms of the ignorance we possess about it. The more he knows that he is unknowing, Nicholas wrote, the more learned he will be. Such a statement harkens back to Socratic irony, yet here it is couched in the vibrant theological speculation of the 15th century. For Nicholas, mathematics, particularly concepts of infinity, played a symbolic role. Just as the infinite cannot be fully captured by finite numbers, so the infinite nature of God cannot be contained within human conceptions. This idea that the infinite always exceeds the finite reappears again and again in later centuries, sometimes in purely theological form, but at other times, especially in the 20th century, in formal logic and mathematics. In the modern era, it would be the Austrian-born logician Kurt Gödel who, in some sense, became the Nicholas of Cusa of mathematical logic. His famous incompleteness theorems, published in 1931, established that in any sufficiently rich formal system of arithmetic, there are true statements that cannot be proven within the axioms of that system. A parallel can be drawn. Where Nicholas of Cusa argued, we cannot contain the divine infinite within our finite minds, Gödel demonstrated that even in the carefully regimented realm of formal logic, where mathematicians and philosophers for centuries had hoped to find absolute certainty, there remain corners of truth that the system itself cannot illuminate. He also showed that the system cannot prove its own consistency if it is, in fact, consistent. Like the man who tries to lift himself by his own bootstraps, a formal system cannot stand outside itself to confirm its own reliability. In simpler terms, logic must humbly acknowledge that there are always truths beyond its power of demonstration. Gödel's theorems sent shockwaves through the philosophical community because they posed a direct challenge to the long-held dream of establishing a complete and consistent axiomatic foundation for mathematics. Before him, mathematicians such as David Hilbert had laid out a program to unify all of mathematics under a single, fully consistent, and complete framework. Gödel effectively proved that such a dream was impossible. Where once the mathematician or the logician might have believed in the unstoppable progress of reason to conquer every last puzzle, Gödel's results forced upon them a gesture of humility. This was not, of course, the first time that reason was forced to bow, but the formality and rigor of Gödel's proofs gave an unassailable clarity to something that philosophers and mystics had long intimated. Every perspective, every structure of thought, labors under certain blind spots. Richard Feynman, the famed 20th century physicist, was no mathematician in the sense of developing formal logic systems, but he was a brilliant expositor of the scientific method and a deep thinker about what science can and cannot do. In some of his more reflective statements, Feynman echoed the same humility that Socrates had expressed, though in more modern idiom. I think it's much more interesting to live not knowing than to have answers which might be wrong, he once said, suggesting that the enjoyment of the unknown is itself integral to the scientific quest. Feynman was acutely aware that scientific theories, no matter how elegant or empirically robust, are never the final word on reality. Instead, they remain models that approximate some facet of reality. Whenever the range of experimental data expands, those models must be re-evaluated or refined. He occasionally pointed out that we must be comfortable with doubt and uncertainty, because those states of mind drive scientific discovery forward. In this sense, Feynman stands in direct lineage with Socrates, Lao Tzu, Nicholas of Cusa, and Gödel. He recognized the necessity of acknowledging what is not known, or perhaps cannot be known, as an essential component of any genuine pursuit of truth. Before continuing with modern reflections, we should thread our story through other key figures who contributed to the idea of limited knowledge. The medieval and early modern periods were alive with giants of inquiry. We might think of Thomas Aquinas, who systematically organized Christian theology and borrowed richly from Aristotle. While Aquinas devoted his life to showing how faith and reason could harmonize, he too was aware that God's essence surpassed human concepts. Aquinas ended his magisterial Summa Theologica by recounting a mystical experience he had near the end of his life, after which he said his previous writings appeared to him as straw compared to the reality he beheld. The weight of that experience underscored that all his erudition was, in the final measure, an approximation. In that sense, he was a synthesizer of reason and revelation, yet he made no claim that reason itself could exhaust the reality of the divine. Thus Aquinas sits neatly among those who champion the notion that the apex of knowledge is, ironically, to acknowledge its shortfall. Roughly contemporaneous with Aquinas, or slightly earlier, we have the Persian polymath Avicenna, Ibn Sina, and the later Muslim philosopher al-Ghazali, each wrestling with the question of the limits of reason, though in different ways. Avicenna championed Aristotelian logic, and tried to build a thoroughgoing philosophical system that integrated Greek philosophy with Islamic theology. Al-Ghazali famously critiqued the overreach of purely rational or philosophical approaches to the divine, particularly in his work The Incoherence of the Philosophers, although there is debate on how precisely to interpret his stance. In that text, he emphasizes how certain truths might remain hidden from purely rational or philosophical methods. This is not to say he was anti-intellectual, rather he insisted that there are domains of knowledge that require not just logical demonstration, but also revelation, spiritual insight, or forms of apprehension that exceed purely discursive reasoning. Whether or not one shares al-Ghazali's religious framework, his concerns about the boundaries of rational thought resonate deeply with the theme we are pursuing here. Later in Europe, René Descartes undertook his famous search for a bedrock of certainty, determined to doubt everything until he found something indubitable. His conclusion, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, stands as the philosophical anchor for modern rationalism. And yet from another angle, Descartes' project underscores the fragility of knowledge. In his attempt to doubt all sense data and everything that might be the product of deception, he was left with only the certainty of his own thinking mind. One might read this as the foundation of modern epistemology, or as a testament to the precariousness of our contact with reality. Our only unassailable knowledge is that there is a thinking entity, but how far that extends into certain knowledge of the external world is another question. In forging a path out of absolute skepticism, Descartes revealed just how easily knowledge might slip away if we lose our trust in the reliability of sense perception, or the uniformity of nature, or even the benevolence of a non-deceiving God, whom he invoked as part of his argument. Though Descartes hoped to ground knowledge in a secure, rationalist edifice, the centuries after him demonstrated that the fortress of certainty might be more fragile than he imagined. In Britain, empiricists such as John Locke, George Berkeley, and David Hume added their voices to the conversation. Locke championed the idea that all knowledge enters the mind through experience, though he allowed for a modest rational framework. Berkeley famously argued that existence is intimately tied to perception, proposing esse est percipi, to be is to be perceived, which destabilized our everyday assumptions about an external world existing independently of our perceptions. But it was David Hume who carried skepticism to a radical pitch, especially on matters of causation and induction. Hume pointed out that our belief in causality, and indeed our expectation that the future will resemble the past, is based not on logical necessity, but on habituated custom. We see that a certain sequence of events has occurred repeatedly, and we assume it will continue. Yet there is no purely rational proof that it must. This is the so-called problem of induction. From Hume's standpoint, our entire edifice of scientific understanding and daily practice rests on an assumption about the uniformity of nature for which we cannot supply a purely rational justification. We live as if tomorrow's sunrise is guaranteed, but logically, we can only say that it has always risen in the past. In a single stroke, Hume revealed that reason, in its reliance on induction, stands on a shaky foundation of unprovable assumptions. This was a direct blow to Enlightenment confidence in the power of reason to explain all things. Rationality, it turned out, had to operate with leaps of faith, perhaps not faith in the religious sense, but faith in the stability and predictability of nature. Immanuel Kant was famously jolted from his dogmatic slumber by reading Hume. In Kant's critique of pure reason, he set out to explore the conditions under which knowledge is possible. One might say Kant discovered a boundary not only in what we know, but in how we know. According to Kant, human experience is inevitably shaped by categories of understanding and forms of sensibility: space, time, causality, and so forth, that structure all possible perception. There is a noumenal realm, things in themselves, that we cannot know as they are in themselves, only as they appear filtered through our cognitive apparatus. Thus Kant boldly asserts that reason cannot trespass into the noumenal domain. It can only grasp phenomena as given to consciousness. Here again we encounter the theme of limits, though cast in a new philosophical vocabulary. We are not infinite minds that know things in themselves directly. We are finite beings, bound by the structure of our faculties. For Kant, it was not so much about a mystical or ineffable dimension, but a systematic philosophical principle. The mind contributes something to the experience of reality that cannot be peeled away. Therefore, our knowledge, however extensive it might become in the phenomena, remains confined to that realm. The Kantian turn in philosophy set the stage for much of what followed in the 19th and 20th centuries, as thinkers wrestled with the legacy of these limitations. G.W.F. Hegel attempted a grand synthesis, hoping to show that the unfolding of spirit or mind through history and dialectical development could eventually achieve something like absolute knowledge. Yet many who followed Hegel found this notion too grand, too reminiscent of the older illusions of totality. The existentialists, such as Kierkegaard and later Sartre, or the phenomenologists, such as Husserl and Heidegger, probed into the conditions of individual existence, subjective experience, and the ways in which meaning is constructed or disclosed. In these movements, one sees repeated references to how the human subject is always situated, always finite, always in a context that prevents the sort of God's eye view that older rationalists might have pursued. Moving back into the sciences for a moment, consider how the rise of quantum mechanics in the early 20th century upended classical assumptions about determinism and the clarity of measurement. Werner Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, stating that one cannot simultaneously know the exact position and momentum of a quantum particle, became an emblem of inherent limitations within physics. This was not a failure of technology or method, but a statement about the structure of the physical laws at the fundamental scale. Similarly, Niels Bohr and the Copenhagen interpretation introduced the principle of complementarity, suggesting that waves and particles are different, but equally valid ways of describing quantum entities, ways that cannot be fully reconciled in a single classical framework. Physics, in other words, encountered its own boundary conditions in describing the subatomic world. Where Newtonian mechanics had once seemed to promise an inexorable march toward total predictive power, quantum theory revealed an embedded indeterminacy and contextuality in how we observe and measure. Such developments, while sometimes over-mystified in popular discourse, do serve as powerful reminders of how the domain of knowledge is shaped, and sometimes constrained, by the perspective and methods of the observer. We might continue with the story of relativity, where Einstein dethroned absolute space and time, showing that simultaneity and measurement depend on one's frame of reference. The illusions of an objective, universal vantage point in space and time were unmasked as illusions indeed. Observers in different inertial frames measure events differently, and the notion of absolute time was replaced by the flexible geometry of spacetime. Once again, the lesson emerges: any vantage point is partial, and sometimes the pursuit of new knowledge unravels the older convictions that knowledge itself is straightforwardly objective. In short, the modern scientific revolution served to underscore on multiple fronts what philosophers and sages had known in their own ways for centuries. We always see from somewhere, and the total view from nowhere is unattainable. Let us not neglect the role that language, culture, and social constructs have in shaping what we can or cannot know. The 20th century witnessed the rise of philosophers of language such as Ludwig Wittgenstein, who, in his later works, especially philosophical investigations, argued that meaning depends on use and that the purported essence of language often dissolves under careful scrutiny. There is no simple naming relation that grounds our words in extralinguistic reality. Rather, the way we speak is bound up with forms of life and cultural practices. While it would be an overstatement to say that Wittgenstein taught that knowledge is impossible, he did show how deeply enmeshed our understanding is in language games and contexts. This points to yet another boundary of knowledge, the framework of concepts and linguistic practices within which any piece of knowledge is situated. Wittgenstein once declared, "Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent." The remark, from the end of his earlier work, the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, suggests that certain domains may be off-limits to clear propositional discourse, again a variation of acknowledging the finite or limited nature of our explanatory scope. Meanwhile, in anthropology and sociology, figures such as Thomas Kuhn in The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, though he was a philosopher of science by training, argued that science proceeds through paradigms, frameworks that shape what questions are asked, what methods are used, and what counts as legitimate data. Paradigm shifts involve transformations that cannot be fully explained merely by rational argument and empirical data. They also involve changes in worldview and community consensus. Kuhn's view hints at the idea that knowledge is historically and socially contingent, not an ever-expanding domain in which we simply accumulate more and more truths. Instead, knowledge can shift ground beneath our feet, showing once again that we are not purely rational beings ascending a linear ladder to total truth, but participants in historically situated processes that can reconfigure themselves drastically. This historical dimension reminds us that even scientific knowledge, so often held up as the pinnacle of objectivity, exists within certain horizons that may alter with time. The limits of knowledge can therefore be partly historical. Knowledge is never the simple reflection of an eternal absolute, but a living interplay of theories, instruments, social beliefs, and conceptual categories. Venturing once more into the realm of mathematics and logic, we return to Gödel's incompleteness theorems, but with an additional mention of Alan Turing. Turing, in exploring computation, proved that there is no general algorithm to solve the halting problem for all possible computer programs. This is reminiscent of Gödelian undecidability, but in the domain of computability theory. His result implies that there are questions about the behavior of a computer program, namely whether it halts on a given input, that can never be solved by a single universal method. One must confront the fact that certain truths about computational processes cannot be captured by a single, universal mechanical procedure. If we interpret logic and computation as the ultimate extension of formal rationality, Turing's proof stands as yet another testimony to the inherent boundaries built into rational systems. Parallel to these developments, we might recall the linguistic turn in philosophy and the shift to postmodern perspectives, where thinkers such as Michel Foucault or Jacques Derrida question the very foundations of objectivity, calling attention to power structures and the slipperiness of signs. While one need not follow them into all the complexities of deconstruction or genealogical critique to appreciate their core insight, it remains relevant that knowledge is never wholly innocent of social, linguistic, and political contexts. Foucault famously examined how discourses shape what is considered knowledge and who can speak authoritatively. Derrida problematized the idea that texts have single determinate meanings. In both cases, we see the theme that knowledge, whether historical, scientific, or philosophical, suffers from interpretive finitude. There is no vantage point that escapes the inherent play of language or the influence of power. For some, this might lead to a radical skepticism. For others, it simply affirms an older recognition that we are limited beings navigating an infinitely complex world. One could draw yet another through line by mentioning Sigmund Freud, who in his own way highlighted the limits of conscious thought, positing that the unconscious mind exerts profound influence over our motives, perceptions, and judgments. Even if many of his specific theories are debated or have been superseded by later psychological research, Freud's overarching proposition remains powerful. We do not even fully know our own minds. There is a part of us that remains opaque to introspection, that can sabotage our reasoning or color our interpretations of reality without our awareness. In a sense, Freud extended the boundary of ignorance inward, showing that we are mysteries unto ourselves. The broad tradition of psychoanalysis and psychotherapy in the 20th century, along with subsequent developments in cognitive science, has carried that banner forward. The mind is not fully transparent to itself, and reason is but one aspect of a labyrinthine interplay of unconscious processes, biases, and heuristics. Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, in their influential work on cognitive biases and heuristics, revealed the systematic ways in which human reasoning departs from the ideal of perfect rationality. From anchoring effects to availability heuristics, from confirmation bias to the base rate fallacy, they and others have shown that ordinary human reasoning is riddled with pitfalls. These empirical findings dovetail neatly with the philosophical tradition of acknowledging limitations. While earlier thinkers approached these limits more abstractly or metaphysically, the field of behavioral economics and cognitive psychology provided experimental evidence. Even if we want to be purely rational, we are constrained by mental shortcuts that can lead us astray. Thus, there is a very real practical dimension to the theme of limited knowledge. It does not only pertain to grand metaphysical or mathematical truths, but to the daily ways in which we navigate decisions. The illusions that Socrates dispelled in his day live on in a new form within our cognitive biases. Another domain that illustrates limits is the study of complex systems and chaos theory. Scientists like Edward Lorenz discovered how tiny changes in initial conditions can lead to vastly different outcomes, an idea captured by the image of a butterfly flapping its wings and eventually altering the path of a tornado weeks later. This is not just a quirk of weather systems. Many phenomena, from stock markets to ecological networks, exhibit high sensitivity to initial conditions. As a result, even if one possesses a theoretical model, predictions become effectively impossible over certain timescales due to exponential divergence of trajectories. This has been referred to as the horizon of predictability. Here is yet another manifestation of how knowledge in practice meets impassable barriers. Even if theoretically we might have a model, in reality, the precision required in measurement to ensure accurate long-term predictions is unattainable. We are thus confronted again with the boundary of our ability to know or to forecast. In a similar spirit, the philosopher Karl Popper argued that scientific theories are never conclusively proven, only falsified. According to Popper, the demarcation criterion for science is that a proposition must be testable in such a way that some potential observation could refute it. But no matter how many observations confirm a theory, it remains logically possible that a future observation will overturn it. In effect, this means we never reach absolute certainty in empirical science. We only accumulate a track record of passing tests. Under Popper's conception, science is an unending process of conjectures and refutations, always subject to revision, always open to being superseded. Here again is the theme of epistemic modesty. We do not hold final truths but provisional best guesses that could be undone by future evidence. Even that which seems certain might be an artifact of our limited vantage or incomplete exploration of phenomena. Returning to our original cast, we can see how these more modern accounts merge seamlessly with the older warnings. Socrates might smile to read Kahneman's findings on human ignorance about our own thought processes. Lao Tzu might nod in recognition at quantum indeterminacy, since he would say that reality cannot be pinned down to a single unchanging form. Nicholas of Cusa, if he were introduced to Gödel's incompleteness theorems, might remark on how mathematics too must bow before the principle of learned ignorance. Feynman, were he to witness chaos theory and complexity science blossoming in the decades after his death, might only intensify his stance that to live with uncertainty is the very heart of scientific wonder. Of course, these thinkers come from distinct contexts, with different motivations and ultimate aims. Socrates was primarily concerned with ethical knowledge and the possibility of living a good life, whereas Lao Tzu was in search of harmony with the Tao. Nicholas of Cusa was a Christian theologian interested in the relationship between human reason and divine transcendence, while Gödel was a logician working within a precise formal framework. Feynman was a practical physicist, enthralled by puzzling phenomena in quantum electrodynamics and beyond. Yet across all these differences, one observes a reverence for the intangible, the unknowable, the unprovable. Call it mystery, call it transcendence, call it the boundary conditions of reason. They each suggest in their own idiom that the quest to know is endless, and that the more deeply one pursues it, the more one becomes aware of how much remains beyond. This lesson of humility does not, however, have to breed despair. Indeed, for many of these figures, acknowledging the limits of knowledge is not the end but the beginning. Socrates used his awareness of ignorance as a spur to endless dialogue. Lao Tzu's aphorisms encourage living in accord with the Tao by attuning oneself to its natural rhythms, precisely because it cannot be reduced to fixed concepts. Nicholas of Cusa's mystical theology invites the devout to adore the infinite in the knowledge of not knowing. Gödel's theorems, while closing the door on the possibility of a complete formal system, open the door to the inexhaustible creativity of mathematical inquiry. And for Feynman, the absence of final answers was what made science captivating. One must keep questioning, keep playing with new ideas, keep testing. That very process of striving while acknowledging incomplete success becomes its own reward. In light of all this, one might wonder, does this inexorable limitation imply that we are trapped in some kind of solipsism or radical skepticism? Historically, many have worried that if we cannot have certain knowledge, maybe we can know nothing at all. But that is not what most of these thinkers conclude. Instead, they see a middle way. We can know some things, we can refine our beliefs, we can build impressive structures of thought, but we should never presume to have captured the entire truth. Socrates kept searching for moral clarity, even if he recognized the difficulty of pinning it down. Lao Tzu did not abandon the possibility of wisdom just because words could not encapsulate the Tao. Nicholas of Cusa wrote extensively on theology and mathematics, even while proclaiming their ultimate insufficiency in the face of the infinite. Gödel, ironically, after proving incompleteness, still believed in a sort of mathematical Platonism, that truths existed even if not provable within a system. Feynman continued to champion experiment and approximate models of reality, forever refining them. Thus, the recurring motif is not to deny the value of knowledge but to hold it lightly, to see it as a process rather than a final product, and to understand that each vantage point, cultural, linguistic, conceptual, both enables insight and imposes constraints. This is the tapestry that runs through the centuries, binding the orchard of Greek city-states to the dusty roads of ancient China, the fervent scholasticism of the medieval cathedral schools to the lively coffeehouses of Enlightenment Europe, and on to the modern laboratories where subatomic particles dance to the tune of uncertain laws, or the blackboards where mathematicians chase unprovable truths. If we zoom out even further, we might recall that the human species, though spectacular in its accomplishments, is but one biological entity on a small planet orbiting one star among billions in a single galaxy among billions. The cosmos in its vastness dwarfs our intellectual reach. Our telescopes peer out across unimaginable distances, capturing faint signals from eons past, yet the very act of observation is confounded by cosmic expansion, dark energy, dark matter, the majority of which we do not understand. Contemporary cosmology brims with speculation about multiverses, cosmic inflation, singularities, and so on, underscoring that the largest questions remain unanswered. Meanwhile, in the domain of the very small, quantum mechanics and quantum gravity remain an unresolved puzzle. Even the greatest minds in theoretical physics have not pinned down a final theory of everything. Indeed, some question whether that phrase even makes sense, given all we have seen about the inexorable constraints of knowledge. Biology adds another angle. The theory of evolution suggests that our cognitive faculties evolved not primarily for the direct apprehension of objective truth, but for survival and reproduction. Our senses and brains are tuned to handle threats and opportunities in the environment, not necessarily to unravel the ultimate structure of reality. Hence, illusions, shortcuts, and partial truths may well be more adaptive than a direct, unfiltered knowledge of the world. This evolutionary perspective resonates with the broader theme of limitation, for it implies that even our best attempts at abstract reasoning are the outgrowth of messy processes of adaptation, riddled with constraints that we might not even suspect. Our evolutionary heritage shapes us at every turn, from the biases we hold to the range of our conceptual imagination. Yet for all this, we humans persist in our quest, weaving more threads into the tapestry of partial knowledge, forever intrigued by the ineffable, the elusive, the overshadowed edges of our mind's horizon. We might conjure the image of a great library of human knowledge, shelves upon shelves of science, mathematics, history, literature, art, and philosophy, an awe-inspiring testament to our collective labor. But in that library, each volume, each category, each classification, and each word is a reminder that we are describing the world through finite constructs. We can expand the library indefinitely, yet it will still stand inside a universe of mysteries we have not yet encoded. And so every rung up the ladder of knowledge reveals new vistas of our ignorance. Furthermore, when we return to the existential dimension, we recall that knowledge, in the sense of the rational or the empirical, is only one aspect of human meaning. Kierkegaard famously wrote about the leap of faith, which some interpret as an acknowledgement that certain fundamental commitments, ethical or religious, cannot be justified solely by reason. If reason cannot yield a final proof of which moral or metaphysical stance to take, then one must choose, risking error, but also possibly embracing authenticity. Whether one adopts his specifically Christian viewpoint or not, the existential theme remains. Part of being human is the necessity of choosing and acting under conditions of uncertainty, forging our meaning without the guarantee of absolute knowledge. This resonates with both the ancient Greek tradition and the broad modern acceptance that final certainty is unattainable, but decision and responsibility are inescapable. In a different but related context, Martin Heidegger wrote of being in the world, where the question of being is not something we can fully conceptually master, but something we are always immersed in. To inquire about the meaning of being is to engage in an unfolding process that never yields a final dictionary definition. One sees how this philosophical line echoes Lao Tzu's pointing at the Tao, or Nicholas of Cusa's mysticism, or even Wittgenstein's caution at the edge of language. We are always in the thick of living, and any attempt to stand outside and have the complete conceptual overview is, in Heidegger's view, a misunderstanding of our finite nature. We might say that the attempt to stand wholly outside existence is itself an impossibility, for to do so, we would have to transcend the structures that make us who we are. One might gather from all these perspectives the recognition that the limits of knowledge are not a single boundary line, but a sprawling, shifting set of frontiers, each discovered by a different style of thought, be it philosophical, scientific, theological, or poetic. And indeed, poetry and art themselves often highlight aspects of reality that defy purely discursive explanation. Artists from William Blake to Emily Dickinson to the modern surrealists have found ways to hint at truths about experience that cannot be directly pinned down or systematically verified, but which ring with subjective resonance. These creative expressions gesture toward the invisible corners of human existence, emotions, intuitions, glimpses of the sublime. Thus, while the Western philosophical canon has often pursued clarity and definition, the arts remind us that certain experiences can be signaled only obliquely. The intangible, the unutterable, the symbolic, these modes of knowing, if that is even the right word, also attest to the depths beyond reason's purview. If we imagine gathering all these figures, Socrates, Lao Tzu, Nicholas of Cusa, Gödel, Feynman, and many others, into a single symposium, a conversation that leaps across time and space, we might hear some spirited debates. Feynman might bristle at too much mysticism or theological talk. Gödel might gravitate toward any discussion about Platonic truths in mathematics. Lao Tzu might quietly note that words are all well and good, but that the deeper Tao eludes them. Socrates might ask probing questions of all attendees, politely suggesting that none of us truly knows as much as we think. Nicholas of Cusa might reflect that each partial perspective can be united in God, yet always as an infinite mystery. And from the corner, perhaps Hume would ask whether we can prove we should care about any of this, while Kant might interject that we can never get beyond the phenomena anyway. It would be a chaotic, enthralling conversation, each participant using the lens of their own cultural or intellectual tradition to home in on a single abiding truth, that we are finite beings peering into an infinite realm. Now, to anchor these reflections in a few key quotations, albeit presented briefly and judiciously, can illustrate how these ideas resonate in their original phrasing. From Socrates, as recounted in Plato's Apology, "I do not think I know what I do not know." The pithiness of the statement strikes at the heart of intellectual humility. From Lao Tzu, Tao Te Ching, "The Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao," a reminder that the ultimate, by definition, transcends our attempts to define. From Nicholas of Cusa, De Docta Ignorantia, "The more he knows that he is unknowing, the more learned he will be." The Paradoxical Path of Enlightenment Through Recognizing Ignorance. From Kurt Gödel, simplified from his incompleteness theorems. Any consistent formal system within which a certain amount of elementary arithmetic can be carried out is incomplete. This stands as a mathematical truth with vast philosophical ramifications. From Richard Feynman. I would rather have questions that can't be answered than answers that can't be questioned. A caution against dogmatism and a celebration of the open-ended nature of inquiry. These quotations, drawn from different centuries and continents, converge on the central message of this long mosaic. The recognition of our limits is not a defeat, but a crucial insight into the nature of thought itself. It invites us to approach learning and exploration with curiosity, wonder, and a healthy dose of skepticism about our own certainties. Indeed, the most dangerous illusions might be those that blind us to our ignorance. In everyday life, the acknowledgement of limited knowledge can foster empathy and open-mindedness. When we realize that none of us has the final word, we might become more tolerant of differing viewpoints. We might listen more carefully, question our assumptions more diligently, and remain alert to the possibility that we might be wrong. This is not to say that all views are equally valid or that truth is entirely subjective. There is a delicate balance between acknowledging one's limitations and descending into a radical relativism. Many of the figures we have discussed prized rational investigation, clarity of thought, and an ongoing quest for genuine knowledge. They simply recognize that such knowledge is partial, provisional, or context-bound, rather than total or absolute. In sum, to survey human history is to see that the question of our epistemic boundaries has never been a minor or peripheral concern. It has been at the center of philosophical, religious, and scientific debates. From the wise humility of Socrates and Lao Tzu in antiquity, to the sophisticated theological speculations of Nicholas of Cusa, to the formal elegance of Gödel's theorems, to Feynman's pragmatic and playful approach to scientific truth, we see an unbroken chain of reflection on the theme that ultimate knowledge lies beyond our grasp. Each era updates the language of this reflection, metaphysical, mystical, logical, empirical, but the underlying theme remains recognizable. It is the recognition that our finite minds, remarkable though they are, dwell within an infinite cosmos of possibility. One might even say that this is less a limit than it is an encounter with the inexhaustible. What if, instead of viewing our limitations as a wall, we see them as an opening into wonder? When a boundary is recognized, it can also be transcended in new directions, not by fully erasing it, but by transforming our understanding of it. Socrates turned the "I know that I know nothing" into a path of infinite inquiry. Lao Tzu turned the inexpressible Tao into a poetic celebration of the world's spontaneity. Nicholas of Cusa turned the infinity of God into a mystical invitation for the intellect to aspire beyond itself. Gödel, by revealing that no formal system can be both complete and consistent, liberated mathematics from the illusion of final closure, making it, in some sense, a domain of endless creative discovery. Feynman found joy precisely in not having final answers, relishing the ongoing detective story that is nature. Therefore, far from paralyzing us, the acceptance of limitations can galvanize us to keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep reaching. We need not adopt a stance of defeatism. Rather, we can embrace the perpetual motion of inquiry. Indeed, many of the greatest scientific breakthroughs happened only after old certainties were questioned, old boundaries recognized, and new horizons glimpsed. That is the paradox. By admitting ignorance, we become more open to learning and insight. The history of exploring these limits, then, is not merely an academic chronicle of ideas, but a living inheritance, shaping how we approach every domain of life. In ethics, acknowledging we do not possess an absolute vantage point might counsel humility and dialogue across cultural lines. In politics, realizing that every ideology rests on assumptions that could be questioned might encourage a more pluralistic civic space. In personal relationships, recognizing the potential for misunderstanding might encourage more compassion. The fruit of appreciating our finite nature is not simply new theories, but a different mode of engagement with ourselves, others, and the universe. Thus, while it is indeed true that human knowledge has expanded in an awe-inspiring fashion, curing diseases, sending probes to distant planets, decoding the genome, and unveiling black holes, the fundamental lessons remain. Despite every leap forward, we have not outgrown the cautionary wisdom of Socrates or Lao Tzu. We carry them with us, and their words ring truer than ever. Each new frontier, be it genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, or the mapping of the cosmos, reveals fresh wonders and fresh questions. Artificial intelligence, for instance, can outperform humans in certain tasks, yet we do not fully understand how advanced machine learning algorithms arrive at their decisions. The so-called black box problem in AI is itself a limitation in our knowledge. We design complex networks that yield impressive results, yet we cannot always interpret them fully. Here is a modern echo of older themes. We create rational systems that outstrip our capacity to interpret them. Even the prospect of discovering extraterrestrial life, or fully understanding consciousness, or forging a grand unified theory of physics, each arrives with cautionary notes that the solutions we find may well lead to deeper enigmas. The higher we climb, the more we see how far there is to go. The frontiers multiply. Yet this is precisely the exhilarating drama of being a curious species. Imagine if we had discovered it all, pinned it all down, comprehended the final blueprint. As Feynman and so many others have remarked, that would be a rather dull outcome. And so we stand figuratively at the shore of an ocean whose depths we can only guess. The tide of human thought ebbs and flows, revealing shells of truth that delight us, but we suspect there are unimaginably vast treasures hidden in the depths. Sometimes, new instruments of inquiry let us dive a little deeper, and we collect fresh wonders. But the ocean extends far beyond our vantage. In that sense, each generation replays the discovery that our knowledge is both vast and minuscule, that we have come a long way and have infinitely further to go. To appreciate all this in a single narrative is to realize that the question of the limits of knowledge is not a specialized concern but touches every aspect of our intellectual and cultural life. The mathematics of Gödel, the theology of Nicholas of Cusa, the aphorisms of Lao Tzu, the dialogues of Plato, the physics of Feynman, the reflections of Kant, the parables of Jesus, the treatises of Aquinas, the cunning riddles of Zen Buddhism, the cosmic humility of modern astrophysics, the social critiques of postmodernism, all revolve around that perennial recognition: we are finite. The world, or reality, or being, or the Tao, however one names it, surpasses us. We can see only part of it, and sometimes we do not see ourselves with clarity. Perhaps the final irony is that in forging such a comprehensive account of limitation, we ourselves risk the very hubris of trying to say it all. But to speak of it does not necessarily mean we claim to surpass it. Rather, we are embodying the tension between wanting to see the big picture and knowing we cannot see the whole. Narrative itself is an attempt to give a shape to the unbounded complexity of ideas and history. Yet if we are wise, we remember that for all the words here, far longer than many might have the patience to read, there are countless more that could be said, and countless experiences that cannot be rendered in words at all. When we walk away from this reflection, we can do so not in despair, but in a quiet awe. If Socrates was correct that the only true wisdom lies in knowing one's ignorance, and if Lao Tzu was right that the ultimate cannot be captured by speech, if Nicholas of Cusa properly taught that recognizing our not knowing brings us closer to the divine, if Gödel demonstrated formal logic's inherent incompleteness, and if Feynman exemplified the delight of exploring mysteries without final answers, then we have before us a luminous testimony to the value of humility. No matter how advanced our civilization becomes, we remain travelers on an endless road, guided more by the lantern of inquiry than by the beacon of final certainty. And maybe in the end, that is precisely what we should cherish. In a universe where everything could be known completely, perhaps all sense of wonder would vanish. It is our limits, in tandem with our curiosity, that drive the creative spirit. We puzzle, we probe, we discover, we revise, and the horizon forever recedes, inviting us onward. The human story, from ancient Athens to the banks of the Yellow River, from medieval cathedrals to modern labs, is in many ways the story of that pursuit. And each generation renews the cycle, forging new theories, new technologies, but also stumbling on new paradoxes, new complexities. So we conclude this long narrative where we began, with the recognition that the search for knowledge goes hand in hand with the recognition of its limit. History is replete with luminaries who have testified to this mystery, and the present moment continues to confirm it. We have not exhausted the matter. Indeed, no single text, no matter how expansive, ever will. And that is the abiding paradox. To know the limit is itself a kind of knowledge, one that liberates us to keep seeking, keep wondering, keep growing, forever balanced between what can be known and what must remain, for now, in the sanctuary of the unknown.